Some stories don't start with shouting, scandals, or betrayal. Sometimes they begin with a joke, a little nickname that seems harmless at first. But then that nickname becomes a thread, and when you pull it, everything starts unraveling. I remember the exact cadence of how John first said it, casual like he was folding the phrase into a paper cup and passing it across the break room table. He grinned, the kind of grin people use when they want you to think they're harmless, and said, we're basically work spouses, right? At the time, I had too many files and not enough sleep to parse the meaning beyond a weak, reflexive laugh. People in our office swapped nicknames like office supplies. We had Deadline Dave, Presentation Polly, a handful of others who wore their roles like uniforms. I shrugged then, tucked my sandwich back into its wrapper, and went on with the day. But it kept happening. The joke didn't die. John would pop up at my desk and drop the line into whatever sentence he had. You and me, work husband and wife, he'd say, like it was a club membership I didn't sign up for. Or he'd lean in during team chats and whisper, we talk more than I do with my actual wife. Sometimes he would punctuate emails with little flirtatious emojis that read more like breadcrumbs than jokes. I deleted the emails because it seemed childish to escalate over a winking face. I told myself, again and again, that people used ill-judged humor as social butter. I told myself it wasn't about me. Offstage, the rest of the office noticed. It's hard for a pattern to be private in a space made of glass and shared desks. People would glance, then look away. A coworker would snort while making coffee and then feign obliviousness. A manager would offer a light, awkward laugh in the hallway and pivot the conversation to a project deadline. No one asked me whether I was okay. I suppose in offices we mistake silence for consent. There were moments I wanted to say something, small, firm, adult things like, please stop, or that makes me uncomfortable. But the thing about small slights is that they are slippery. By the time you decide whether to name them, they've already congealed into an atmosphere. Each time I considered speaking up, John's smile got a little wider, and my confidence thinned just a little. I had seen how office dramas complicated careers. I had watched people get labeled and quietly sidelined. So I did what most people do when they don't want to push a rock uphill. I performed tolerance. Last Thursday was the kind of gray day that makes fluorescent lights look cruel. Rain scratched at the windows, and everyone moved a little slower, dragging their umbrellas like luggage. I went to the break room for lunch with the guarded consolation that even in an office full of small cruelties, food can be a neutral ground. I found John propped against the counter, a plate in hand, already mid-sentence with a story about a training seminar he'd survived the day before. The conversation was light, the kind of small talk that patches holes between meetings. Then he grinned, the same grin, and said, so, work wife, you'll take care of my career counsel today, right? There was a thread of earnestness to it now, a way he said it that suggested he genuinely believed our rapport was something other than circumstantial. The room tightened. I tried to laugh it off, a reflex this time right out of habit. But even that felt like a theatrical gesture. A few coworkers looked over with the kind of expression I had learned to interpret as either curiosity or judgment. I folded my napkin with deliberate slowness and studied the pattern of cheap laminate on the table. It all happened so fast after that. The door to the break room opened and a gust of cold air followed, carrying with it a small human figure, a preschool-aged child in a bright yellow raincoat, dragging a too big backpack. Behind the child was a woman whose presence made John, for the first time in my experience, look like a man caught naked in a storm. She wore a tired smile that did not reach her eyes. She scanned the room with the professional steadiness of someone who knew what they was looking for. Then her gaze landed on me. "Oh," she said, loud enough for the room to absorb, and the single syllable sounded like a verdict. "So you must be her." The playground tune of the child's small requests faded into a hush. The coffee machine hissed like a gossipy witness. I remember the exact shape of my internal panic, a hollowing that makes you aware of every step, every breath, every small movement in a room. I slung my tray up with a speed that surprised me and bolted out of there. People stopped their mid-chew. A spoon clinked against a bowl. John's face was the color of a sunset, and then the color of someone who had been stripped of a costume, embarrassed, furious, stunned. I ran not because I was ashamed of a perceived intimacy. Honestly, the notion was laughable, but because I could feel the office pivoting, turning toward me like a slow and inexorable tide. In those few seconds, I had the infantile clarity of someone seeing a crowd for what it was. A net that could entangle or a wind that could carry rumor to places you would rather not have it. I didn't want to be the story at the center of that tide. Outside, rain hit the sidewalk in a hard, splashing rhythm. I leaned against the cool brick of the building and breathed in the wet air as if it could scrub the situation clearer for me. My phone buzzed, a message from a coworker. "Did you see? Are you okay?" And then another. "He's a jerk." And another. We all saw. The messages felt like hands pulling at pieces of me. When I walked back into the office an hour later, the atmosphere had coagulated into rumor. People paused at their desks like actors in a play that had taken an unexpected turn. John avoided my gaze entirely. He would clear his throat in a hallway and take a different route. He acted like someone suddenly suspicious of his own shadow. A friend later told me that after I bolted, there had been an avalanche of whispered apologies from the wives and partners who had seen this behavior and assumed it was harmless, something silly they'd laugh off at home. Then someone else, a man at the copy machine, said, "She's the one who called him out last time for staying late." I realized that everyone had a piece of information. No one had assembled it into a coherent shape. It would have been easy to let the incident be a single, embarrassing episode. People are good at that. They like tidy endings and small scandals that burn bright and die. But curiosity, dark and patient, started to tug. The nickname had been a thread. Pulling it revealed seams I had not meant to open. In meetings after that week's end, the tone shifted like a radio dial sliding to a different station. No one addressed it openly. It's a strange, modern etiquette. We avoid the subject in the room because to speak it aloud would be to force the room to choose sides. The corporate HR department, paradoxically, had one man named John who liked to say he specialized in employee relations. After the incident, he stopped being conversational in a way that felt incompetent and began to act like someone who measures a misstep for a long time before making a move. Rumor turned to a test of my own patience. Colleagues who had smiled at our small jokes now either avoided me or looked over their shoulders as if the act of looking might make them complicit. A few tried to make overtures of normalcy. "Lunch?" asked a voice that sounded like it was practicing the word. I accepted the invitations that felt genuine and declined the ones that tasted like duty. John's withdrawal was not the confession I had imagined. There was no confrontation, no tearful apology, no scene. Instead, there was a cold civility that felt worse than anger. People who avoid you rarely think about the consequences of their avoidance. They flee as if distance is a moral act. John seemed to have retreated from the world he had made comfortable for himself. And in that retreat there was a fragile, dangerous silence. The kind that shelters denial. A week passed. Work swallowed the days in its steady appetite. I resolved to do my job with a kind of meticulousness that felt like armor. The rhythm of my emails and reports became my identity, efficient, calm, obviously unaffected. It helped, at least on the surface. But under the surface, the incident had unearthed a chronic ache. I wondered why it had been so hard to speak up in the moment. I wondered whether I should have named my discomfort earlier. I wondered whether my silence had been misread as consent and whether that, in turn, had given John license to escalate his banter. Then came the approved leave of absence notice on John's desk. He was out for a few days. Personal reasons. The manager had said in a way that felt too tidy. 5 days later, the whispers softened into a rumor with a shape. John's wife had spoken to HR, the story went, and asked that he take some time off. People who knew more nodded with the uncomfortable empathy of those who have watched private lives leak into public spaces before. I had mixed feelings. Part empathy for anyone whose marriage is fraying, part resentment that I would be the unexpected center of their unraveling. I found myself in the odd place of wanting to know how much of John's behavior was a symptom and how much was a choice. Workplaces are ecosystems. People bring their broken parts in and expect others to adapt. That expectation is not always malicious. Sometimes it is laziness. Sometimes it is neglect. Sometimes, and dangerously, it is willful obtuseness. The next Monday he returned. He blended into the office like a man who had practiced the expression of innocence in the mirror and now deployed it professionally. For a while he spoke to nobody with a warm normalcy. He maintained a polite distance, and I maintained mine. Our lunchroom encounters were quick exchanges about coffee, nothing more. He never again called me work wife in public. There was a small relief in that, a neat repair. But for me, the rupture continued. A wound existed in the texture of daily life that a changed phrase could not sterilize. It could have ended there, a small human misstep caught and corrected, a lesson learned and forgotten. But life does not always gift neat closures. Months later, when I was least expecting it, I received a message from John. It was short. "Can we talk?" I ignored it for a day, then two. On the third day, I let myself meet him in a corner of the office near the stairwell, where the echo makes voices feel smaller and contained. He looked older in that stairwell light. He had a paper cup of coffee in his hand and the kind of weary face that business travel doctors call resting damage. John ran his fingers through his hair in a way that said he had rehearsed this moment. "I wanted to apologize," he said, before I could offer any greeting. "Not in the way that makes it about me. I mean a real apology. I was careless. I thought it was a joke, and I kept pushing it because it made me feel like I had a connection with someone. That was selfish. I saw how it landed, and I didn't stop." There was an honesty to his confession that made it hard to be numbed by anger. He looked like a man who had finally found a shape for his shame. My wife, she came in that day because she couldn't keep pretending she didn't notice me acting like an idiot around people at work. She said things she didn't mean to say, and she made it worse in front of everyone. He swallowed. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. You never deserved that." I listened. I let my face be the ledger of my reaction. He had said the words I had wanted to hear, but words are not always the same as repair. I had been unmoored in a small way. I had been aware, for weeks, of a subtle erosion in how people treated me. There had been whispers. There had been invitations retracted. There had been the weird calculus of a room measuring whether you were safe to laugh with. "Why didn't you stop sooner?" I asked finally. He looked at me as if the answer had been a weight he had carried. "Because I didn't realize how much it mattered until it mattered," he said. "I thought making small talk would make up for me feeling disconnected at home. I see now how idiotic that was. I'm not making excuses. I should have stopped." There was a long silence. I thought of the small rituals of our workplace, the shared coffee, the whiteboard jokes, the way people trusted certain corners of the office to be safe spaces. John's behavior had made one corner shadowed. "Okay," I said. "Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it." It was not an absolution. It was not a handshake contract. It was a momentary truce offered from a place of tiredness. He nodded, and we parted. He walked back to his desk with a slow step, and I went to my inbox and opened a spreadsheet as if numbers could soothe social wounds. Over the months that followed, some things softened. John learned to recalibrate. He was less performative and more respectful. Occasionally he would check in with a quiet, "Are you okay with this?" before a joke, as if he had installed a small checkpoint in himself. People forgave where they felt inclined to forgive. I forgave where I could, more as a practical form of moving forward than a surrender. The office regained some of the old rhythms. I had coffee with coworkers. We laughed. We made plans for team lunches that did not involve public spectacle. But forgiveness and forgetting are not the same. There is a difference between a wound stitched and a scar that changes the face of a place. The lesson I carried with me, the ache that threaded through my days like a small, stubborn tick, was about boundaries. About saying something small and direct before jokes calcify into patterns. About understanding that silence is not safety. About knowing that you can be kind and firm in the same breath. I learned to name discomfort without melodrama. It took practice. Once, in a meeting, a junior person attempted a joke that landed wrong. I looked up and said, simply, "That lands strangely with me." The room shifted, and we carried on. The effect was immediate. No drama. Just a correction delivered in daylight. The more times I practiced that small courage, the less likely I became to be folded into someone else's narrative. There is sadness in that learning. You lose the luxury of assuming goodwill in everything. You gain a more vigilant kindness. I missed being able to be naive and laugh without checking the edges. But there is also gain. The knowledge that setting a line does not make you a troublemaker. It makes you someone who values dignity in the small transactions of daily life. Sometimes I see John in the hallway, and there is a nod, small and spare. Once he invited me to a voluntary training session on workplace boundaries and offered to share his experience as a cautionary tale. He spoke with the quiet of someone who had been humbled and who hoped his mistake could be a lesson for others. I watched him and thought of the stairwell apology, of the woman with the tired smile who had marched into the break room and altered the air that day. I thought of all the private reckonings that happen in public places. In the end, it is hard to frame the story as simply as villain and hero. Human beings are stitches of contradiction, capable of kindness and thoughtlessness, valor and cowardice. I walked away from that lunchroom with my cheeks burning and my heart pounding, but I came back with a skill I value now more than before. I can say, plainly, what I need. If I could tell younger me one thing, it would be this: name your boundary early. Don't wait for the crowd to decide whether you're worthy of protection. People will joke, people will err, but your silence only makes it easier for someone else to define you. Say the line. Hold it. You will be surprised how many people will stand beside you when you do. And when I tell the story now, I start with the same line. Sometimes stories begin with jokes. Sometimes they end with regret. Sometimes, if you're lucky, they end with learning.